The whole class watched him bully me. Now, the whole class watches him chase me. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in a lecture hall of 200 people, the kind where a single dropped pen sounds like a gunshot and every head turns toward you instead of the noise. I knew that silence intimately. I had lived inside it for almost a full semester, ever since the day Jason Branch decided that my existence was something worth correcting in front of an audience. It started small. A comment about my secondhand jacket, tossed out while the professor was still writing on the board, just loud enough for the front 3 rows to hear and laugh. Then it was my handwriting, projected onto the screen during a peer review exercise, with Jason leaning back in his chair and asking the whole room if anyone could actually read chicken scratch like that. Then it was bigger, crueler, more personal. The rumor he started about why I always sat alone at the back of the dining hall. The voice he used when he called me where, like the word itself, was an insult, flat and final, no warmth in it at all. I want to tell you I was used to it by the time this story really begins, but that would be a lie I tell myself on the bad nights. The truth is that every single time it still landed somewhere soft and unguarded in my chest, and every single time I still showed up to the next class, because dropping out of advanced structural theory would have meant losing my scholarship. And losing my scholarship would have meant going home to a town that had already decided who I was supposed to become. So I stayed. I sat 3 rows from the back, by the window, where the afternoon light made it just bright enough that I could pretend the heat in my face was sunburn and not humiliation. And Jason Branch sat near the front, surrounded by people who laughed when he wanted them to laugh, golden and effortless in the way that some people simply are. As if the universe had drafted him first and built everyone else around the leftover material. This story is about the day all of that started to come apart, not unravel. Come apart the way a knot comes apart when someone finally finds the one thread that was holding the whole thing together and pulls. It happened on an ordinary morning, gray-skied, the kind where the campus smelled like wet stone and old coffee. I was running my hand along the railing of the lecture hall stairs, balancing a tray of bad cafeteria eggs and a laptop bag that weighed more than my own ambition. When my foot caught the edge of the bottom step, I didn't fall all the way. That would almost have been a mercy, something quick and clean and over. Instead, I stumbled, my tray tipping eggs sliding across the tile in a slow, humiliating arc, and my bag strap catching on the railing so that I hung there for one endless second, suspended between dignity and disaster. While half the room turned to look, I heard the laugh before I saw who it came from. I already knew, though. I always knew. "Careful, Ware," Jason called out, his voice carrying easily over the rustle of 200 students settling into their seats. "Some of us actually need this floor to walk on." The room laughed with him, the way it always did, an obedient little wave of sound that crested and then died down into murmurs and the rustle of notebooks. I felt my ears burned. I bent down, gathered the tray, the eggs now a sad yellow smear against white tile, and I did the thing I always did, which was nothing. I said nothing. I swallowed it, the way you swallow a stone, feeling it scrape all the way down, and I walked to my seat by the window. What I did not expect, what nobody in that room expected, least of all me, was for Jason Branch to stop laughing 3 seconds later than everyone else. I noticed it because I was watching him. I always watched him, in the specific, helpless way you watch a storm cloud on the horizon, gauging how much time you have before it reaches you. And in that extra 3 seconds, something in his face had gone strange. Not guilty, exactly, not yet. Something more like surprise, like he had heard his own voice land in the room and hadn't expected the sound it made. He didn't apologize. People like Jason Branch don't apologize in front of an audience, not in chapter 1 of any story. But for the rest of that lecture, every time I glanced up, and I try very hard not to glance up, his eyes were already on me, and they didn't look away fast enough to pretend they hadn't been. Quit pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. My name is Austin Ware, and if you had told me at the start of that semester that the boy who made my life a quiet daily hell would, by its end, be the one standing in the rain outside my dorm at midnight, refusing to leave until I let him explain himself, I would have laughed in your face, not a kind laugh, the kind that comes out sharp, like a door slamming. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and this isn't a story that deserves to be rushed. It deserves to be told the way it happened to me, slowly, painfully, and then all at once. To understand how deep the damage went, you have to understand what an entire semester of it looked like, stacked one small cruelty on top of another until the weight of it became something I carried into every room, whether Jason was in it or not. There was the week he started a running joke about my scholarship, suggesting in front of our entire study group that the university must be desperate for diversity numbers if they were letting people like me in on a free ride. I never told anyone how long I sat in the bathroom after that particular comment running the tap, so no one would hear telling myself it didn't matter what people like him thought, while some smaller, more honest part of me knew it mattered enormously because I had fought too hard for that scholarship to let it become a punchline. There was the time he commandeered a class presentation to do an impression of me exaggerating a stutter I only got when I was nervous, drawing laughter so loud the professor had to ask the room to settle down, and never once looking at me directly while he did it, as if making eye contact might have required him to notice I was a person instead of material. There was the rumor, the worst of them, the one that took weeks to fade, that I had cheated on an exam, a lie with no foundation that Jason let circulate without correction, because correcting it would have meant admitting he found me interesting enough to think about when I wasn't in the room. I spent 2 weeks being looked at sideways by professors who had no reason to doubt me until they did, and it took an actual review of my exam paper requested by a professor who happened to respect my work to clear my name. Jason never apologized for that one specifically. I don't think, at the time, he even understood the damage a rumor like that could do to someone with no social capital to spend defending himself. I tell you all of this not to dwell in it, but because forgiveness without an honest reckoning of the wound is just another kind of lie. And I refuse to tell this story as though the hurt was small or easily set aside. It wasn't. It took root in me in ways that outlasted the semester itself, in the careful way I still sometimes flinch at sudden laughter in a crowded room. In the months it took before I could hear my own name spoken aloud without bracing for what might follow it. After the egg incident, as I privately and bitterly named it, I expected things to go back to normal. Normal, for me, meant a careful invisibility, a strategy I had perfected over 4 months of sharing a building with Jason Branch. I sat where he couldn't easily see me. I left lectures 3 minutes early so I wouldn't have to pass his cluster of friends by the door. I had learned the architecture of that building the way a soldier learns a minefield, every safe path memorized, every danger zone marked in my mind with invisible red flags. What I did not expect was for Jason to start appearing in places that weren't supposed to be on his map at all. The library was the first place. I worked nights at the reference desk on the 3rd floor, a job nobody wanted because it meant memorizing the Dewey Decimal System and dealing with freshmen who thought, "I need a source," was a complete request. It was quiet up there, mostly empty after 9, just me, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the smell of old paper that I had come to find almost comforting. He came in on a Thursday, not the first Thursday, but I'm not interested in counting days the way some people count steps, so let's just say it was a Thursday, gray-lit and ordinary right up until it wasn't. He had a textbook under his arm that I happened to know wasn't from any class he was taking. Because I had memorized his schedule, the way you memorize the layout of a house you're trying not to get trapped in. "I need a book," he said, standing at my desk like he hadn't spent the last 4 months treating my existence as a punchline. "The library has several," I said, not looking up from the returns cart. "Try any shelf." There was a pause. I could feel him standing there, and I refused to give him the satisfaction of my attention, even though every nerve in my body was tuned to his presence the way a compass needle is tuned to north. helpless and involuntary. "I'm trying to apologize," he said finally, and his voice had lost the polish it wore in front of an audience. It sounded almost young, almost real. I looked up then because I couldn't help it. "For which part?" He didn't have an answer ready. That, more than anything, was what made me believe. Just a little, just a crack of light through a door I had nailed shut. That something in him might actually be shifting. Jason Branch always had an answer ready. He performed confidence the way other people performed magic tricks, smooth and rehearsed and designed to make you forget to ask how it worked. The fact that he stood there, silent, searching, told me more than any speech could have. "I don't know," he admitted. "All of it, I guess." "That's not an apology," I said. "That's a vague feeling." "Then let me buy you coffee and turn it into a real one." I should have said no. I want it on record for whatever it's worth, that every instinct I had screamed at me to say no, that this was a trick, a new and more elaborate way to humiliate me. That boys like Jason Branch did not simply wake up one gray Thursday and decide to be decent to the people they'd spent a semester grinding down, but there was something in his face, a kind of exhaustion, like he'd been carrying something heavy for longer than he could explain, that made the no stick in my throat. "I have work," I said instead, which was true and also a kind of surrender. Because everyone in that library knew the reference desk closed at 11, and there was a coffee cart in the lobby that stayed open until midnight specifically for people like us. "I'll wait," he said. And he did. For 2 hours, in a library chair too small for someone his size, reading a textbook from a class he wasn't taking, he waited. I think the part of this story that people find hardest to believe when I tell it now is that I didn't fall for him in a single dramatic moment. There was no scene where the music changed and the world tilted on its axis. It was slower than that and uglier, because falling for someone who has hurt you is not a clean thing. It comes tangled up with suspicion and old scar tissue, with the part of your brain that keeps checking the exits even while another part of you is leaning closer to the fire. That night, over coffee that had gone lukewarm by the time either of us drank it, Jason told me things he had clearly never said out loud to anyone in that lecture hall. He told me about his older brother, a name that came up like a weight dropped on the table. A brother who had been the golden one before Jason. The one who set the bar so high that Jason had spent his whole life either trying to clear it or trying to make everyone forget there was a bar at all. He told me in halting pieces about a father who measured love in trophies and grade point averages, who had looked at a B+ on a report card once and asked without any cruelty in his voice, only disappointment, whether Jason was even trying. "I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me," he said, turning the paper cup in slow circles on the table. "I'm telling you because I think I started. I don't know. I think I saw you sitting alone, doing fine, not performing for anyone, not needing anyone to laugh at the right moment. And it made something in me feel like you were doing the thing I didn't know how to do. And instead of admiring it, I think I wanted to break it, so it would match." I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, rain had started, the soft kind that you only notice because of how it changes the sound of a room, a low hush against the windows. "That's not an excuse," I said finally. "I know," he said immediately, like he'd been waiting for me to say it so he could agree. "It's not an excuse, it's just true. I don't expect it to fix anything." "Then what do you expect?" He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him in the sense of having shared oxygen with him for a semester, not known him in any way that mattered yet. His expression didn't have an audience to perform for, it was just for me. "I don't expect anything," he said. "I just didn't want to keep being someone who hurt you and pretended I didn't notice." I went home that night with my chest feeling strange, like a room that's just had furniture rearranged in it, familiar and unfamiliar at once. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself a lot of things that semester that turned out, eventually, to be lies I'd needed in order to keep walking. It was around this time that I told him, for the first time, why the scholarship comment had cut as deep as it did, and why I guarded my own history the way I did. We were sitting on the library steps after closing, the campus mostly empty, The kind of late hour that makes confession feel safer than it would in daylight. You ask a lot of questions about me, I said, and you never ask anything about where I came from. I didn't think I'd earned the right to ask, he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, like he was handling something breakable. So I told him. I told him about a town where ambition was treated like betrayal, where my own father had told me without any real malice, just a kind of tired resignation, that boys who wanted too much usually ended up disappointed. And that I should learn to want less so I wouldn't have so far to fall. I told him about the year I spent applying to scholarships in secret, filling out forms in the school library after hours because I didn't want anyone at home to see how badly I wanted to leave. I told him that the worst part of his joke about my scholarship hadn't been the humiliation in the moment. It had been how closely it echoed a voice I'd spent years trying to outrun. He didn't apologize again. We had moved past the point where apology alone meant anything. What he did instead was listen all the way to the end, without flinching, without trying to make it smaller than it was. "I'm sorry I made you feel like that voice was right," he said finally. "You didn't want too much. You wanted exactly the right amount, and you fought for it. And that's the bravest thing I've ever watched someone do up close." I didn't have a response for that. I just sat there in the dark beside him, feeling something in my chest loosen that had been clenched tight for longer than I could remember. The thing about a lecture hall of 200 people is that they notice everything, eventually. They had noticed the bullying because Jason made sure they noticed. It was easier to be cruel in front of witnesses, easier for the cruelty to spread when it had an audience to carry it outward like a current. So it should not have surprised me that they noticed the change too, though it did every single time. In a way that made my stomach drop with something between dread and a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. It started with small things. Jason saving me a seat. Not beside him, not at first, but near enough that I'd find myself glancing over before I could stop myself, and find him already glancing back. Jason correcting someone in our study group who tried to make a joke at my expense, his voice flat and final in a completely different way than it used to be. The kind of final that closes a door instead of opening one. "That's not funny," he said once, when a guy named Derek made a comment about my jacket, an echo of the very same joke Jason himself had made months earlier. The room went quiet in a way I recognized, the old quiet, except this time it wasn't aimed at me. Derek laughed it off, the way you do when you've misjudged a room. "Since when do you care, Branch?" "Since now," Jason said, and didn't elaborate, and the conversation moved on. But I caught Derek looking at the two of us for the rest of the session with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not suspicion exactly. More like the look of someone watching a structure they'd assumed was load-bearing get quietly dismantled in front of them. By the third week of this strange new arrangement, I had started keeping a kind of internal ledger, tallying up every small kindness against every old cruelty, trying to calculate whether the math could ever balance. It never did, not in any honest accounting, but the ledger kept growing anyway because Jason kept adding to it and I kept watching, helpless, the way you watch weather you can't control. He started walking the same direction as me after lectures, even though his dorm was on the opposite side of campus. He started bringing me coffee, not buying it for me with some grand gesture, just appearing at the reference desk with 2 cups, setting one down without ceremony. Like it was simply what you did when you were getting one for yourself anyway. "You don't have to do this," I told him one night, the 5th or 6th time it happened. My voice sharper than I meant it to be because I didn't know what to do with the warmth spreading through my chest. And warmth after months of cold felt dangerous in a way I didn't have words for yet. "I know," he said, settling into the same too small chair he'd claimed as his own. "I want to." "Why?" He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything now, like a person relearning how to move through the world without the armor he used to wear. "Because every time I see you," he said, "I think about how much time I wasted making you feel small, and I want to spend the rest of it doing the opposite. I don't know if that makes sense." "It doesn't erase it," I said. I needed him to understand that. I needed myself to understand it too, because some nights lying awake, I would feel the old hurt rise up out of nowhere. a flare of anger so sudden it frightened me. And I would have to remind myself that wanting to forgive someone and having already forgiven them are not the same thing, and pretending otherwise serves no one. I know it doesn't, he said. I'm not asking you to erase it. I'm just asking you to let me be here while you decide whether you can stand me. I didn't answer that night, but I didn't ask him to leave either, and in the language we were slowly building between us, that had started to mean something. The shift became impossible to ignore in public the day of the group project presentations, the kind of academic ritual designed to humiliate as efficiently as it educates. I had been paired through the particular cruelty of a randomized seating chart with 3 people who had spent the semester laughing at Jason's jokes about me, and as I stood at the front of that same lecture hall, my hands sweating around a stack of note cards, I felt the old fear rise up in my throat like floodwater. I stumbled on my opening line. Just slightly. A stutter, a repeated word, nothing catastrophic. But in a room that had once turned my smallest mistakes into entertainment, even a small stumble felt like blood in water. I heard the breath before the laugh. That specific intake of air that precedes mockery somewhere in the second row, and I braced myself the way you brace for a blow you felt before and know exactly how it lands. The laugh never came. Or rather, it came and died almost instantly, smothered by a single sharp word from somewhere near the front. Don't, Jason said. Just that. One syllable low and certain, and the room. The same room that had laughed at me a dozen times that semester. The same room that had treated my humiliation as a kind of communal entertainment, went still, and stayed still while I finished my presentation in a silence that felt for the first time in months like safety instead of suspense. Afterward, in the hallway, my hands still shaking slightly with adrenaline, I found him waiting by the door, the way he had started waiting for me without ever quite asking permission to. You didn't have to do that, I said, the same sentence I'd been repeating to him for weeks, worn smooth from overuse. You keep saying that, he said, like it's going to make me stop. Doesn't it bother you? I asked. Everyone watching, everyone talking about you, about us, wondering what happened to you. He looked at me for a long moment, and there was something steady in his face that hadn't been there back when steadiness was just a performance he did for an audience. They watched when I hurt you, he said. I figure they can watch this too. I didn't have a response for that. I'm not sure one existed. I just stood there, in a hallway full of students filing past us toward their next class, and let the warmth of his words settle somewhere in my chest where the old cold used to live. It would be easy, in the telling of this, to make it sound like the rest was simple, that the bullying ended and the romance bloomed and everything proceeded in a straight, sunlit line toward happiness. But anyone who has ever tried to rebuild trust with someone who broke it knows that the road is not straight. It loops back on itself. It has switchbacks where old wounds reopen for no reason except that they were never given the chance to heal properly in the first place. There was a night, maybe a month, into whatever this was becoming, when I woke from a dream about the egg incident, the laughter, the heat in my face. The particular cruelty of his voice calling out, "Where?" like it was an insult, and I lay there in the dark feeling like the last month had been a kind of fever, something I would wake up from to find myself back in that old familiar cold. I sent him a text at 2 in the morning that I regretted immediately. Something short and bitter. I don't know if I can do this. Ald's E, he called me. Not texted back. Called at 2 in the morning, and when I answered, his voice was rough with sleep, but completely alert, like he'd been startled into full consciousness the instant my name appeared on his screen. Talk to me, he said. No greeting, no preamble. I had a dream about the eggs, I said, which sounded stupid the moment it left my mouth. But he didn't laugh, didn't make me explain further. I think about that day a lot, he said quietly. Not because it was special, because it was the day I first noticed myself doing it and didn't stop. I keep thinking, if I'd stopped that day instead of 3 more weeks later, how much more time we'd have had where I wasn't the person who hurt you. You can't go back and fix that, I said, my voice catching in a way I hated. No, he agreed, I can't. I can only keep choosing not to be him anymore, every day, for as long as you'll let me. That's all I've got, Austin. It's not enough, probably, but it's all I've got. I didn't say anything else that night. I just stayed on the phone with him, both of us silent, listening to each other breathe across the distance between our dorms, until the panic in my chest loosened enough that I could close my eyes again. In the morning, there was a coffee waiting outside my door, with a note that said nothing dramatic, nothing performative, just still here. Always going to be still here, even on the nights you doubt it. I kept that note longer than I'd like to admit. The campus, as campuses do, eventually ran out of patience for subtlety. By the time midterms rolled around, our entire lecture hall had constructed an elaborate mythology around the two of us, one that bore only a passing resemblance to the truth, but contained somewhere in its exaggerations a kernel of something real. "They're saying you two are basically together," my roommate told me one evening, not unkindly, just reporting the news the way you'd report a weather forecast. "Apparently someone saw him carrying your bag across the quad." "He didn't carry my bag," I said. "He took half my books because I was struggling with the strap, which is different." "Sure," she said, in the tone of someone who didn't believe a word of that distinction mattered. It mattered to me, though. Not the difference between carrying a bag and carrying books, but the difference between what we were and what people assumed we were, because I still hadn't said it out loud to him. The thing that had been building in me for weeks. The thing I was almost too afraid to name even in the privacy of my own head. The naming happened, in the end, on an evening that started with nothing more dramatic than rain. We had been at the library again, working through a problem set neither of us particularly understood, and when we finally surfaced from our books, it was already dark outside. The kind of dark that comes early in the part of the year when the light starts giving up sooner each day. The rain had started while we weren't looking, and by the time we stepped outside, it had become the steady, soaking kind that no umbrella truly defeats. "We should run for it," Jason said, glancing at the sky like it had personally betrayed him. "You go ahead," I said. "I don't run in the rain. It's undignified." He laughed. Really laughed. The kind I'd started to recognize as different from his performance laugh, lower and a little surprised at itself. And instead of running ahead, he stayed beside me, matching my unhurried pace while the rain soaked through both our jackets. "You're going to catch a cold," I told him. "Worth it," he said. "For what?" He stopped walking. I hadn't expected him to, and I took 2 more steps before I noticed and turned back. The rain running down both our faces. The streetlights turning every drop into something briefly silver before it vanished into the dark. "For more time with you before I have to say goodnight," he said. And there was nothing performed in it at all. No audience anywhere in sight to explain why he might have said it. Just the rain and the two of us, and a sentence that landed somewhere in my chest like a stone, dropped into still water, sending ripples I felt for a long time after. "Jason," I said, and his name in my mouth felt different than it ever had before, less like a word and more like an admission. "Yeah? I think I'm in love with you," I said, and I genuinely don't know whether that makes me an idiot or the bravest I've ever been. He didn't answer right away. He just closed the distance between us, slow enough that I had every opportunity to step back if I'd wanted to, and I didn't want to, not even a little. And when he kissed me, it tasted like rain and like the particular relief of finally setting down something you've been carrying for far too long. "Both," he murmured against my mouth, when we finally pulled back enough to breathe. "Definitely both. I've been in love with you since before I knew how to stop being cruel about it, and I am so sorry it took me this long to be brave enough to be kind instead." We stood there in the rain for longer than was reasonable, both of us soaked through, neither of us willing to be the one who suggested we go somewhere dry. Because some moments are worth the cold you'll regret in the morning. If this were a simpler story, it would end there, in the rain, with the confession and the kiss serving as the final note. But love that survives cruelty has to prove itself more than once, and the hardest proof came not from Jason, but from the world around us. The same world that had spent a semester watching him hurt me and now seemed almost hungry for a reason to believe none of the change had been real. It started with a name I didn't recognize at first. A girl named Priya, who lived on Jason's old floor and had apparently dated him briefly the year before any of this began. She cornered me outside the chemistry building on an afternoon that had started out unremarkable, her voice pitched low and confiding in the specific way people use when they want you to believe they're doing you a favor. "I just think you should know," she said, "before you get in any deeper." Last year, a few of the guys on his floor had this whole thing going. A bet, basically, about who could get the most unlikely person to fall for them. "I heard your name come up. I don't know if it's still going, but I'd hate for you to find out the hard way. I want to tell you, I didn't believe her. I want to tell you that the months of small kindnesses, the coffee at the reference desk, the steady weight of his hand finding mine, the confession he'd built so slowly and carefully it couldn't possibly have been architecture for a joke. I want to tell you all of that was armor enough against one rumor from a girl with her own reasons to want us apart. But the old fear doesn't dissolve just because new evidence arrives to argue against it. It waits, it has patience, and it found, in Priya's words, exactly the crack it had been looking for since the Rain confession, since the moment I'd let myself believe in something this good without bracing for the cost. I didn't confront Jason right away. I did something worse, in its way. I went quiet. I let the calls go unanswered for one night, then two, watching his texts arrive with increasing concern, each one, a small stone dropped into a silence I had built without explanation. Because some part of me wanted to test whether he would chase the way Priya's words implied he might have once chased on a dare, or whether he would simply let me go the way I half expected deep down. That everyone eventually did. He showed up at my door on the third night, and I almost didn't answer. When I did, his face had the look of someone who hadn't slept, who had spent 2 days running through every possible explanation for my silence and landed on the worst ones. "What happened?" he asked, no preamble, the way he always asked things that mattered. I told him. I watched his face while I told him, watched the confusion give way to something that looked almost like physical pain, watched him search the way he had searched for an answer that first night in the library, for the right combination of words to undo what Priya's rumor had already done. "That bet was real," he said finally, and my stomach dropped even as some small, exhausted part of me appreciated that he hadn't tried to lie his way past it. "It was real, last year, before I knew you, before any of this. I was a different person then, Austin. The kind of person who thought making someone fall for me was a game with no consequences for the person on the other end of it. I'm not proud of it. I should have told you it existed instead of letting you find out from someone else." "So it's true," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "It's true that the bet existed," he said. "It is not true that it has anything to do with you. You weren't on anyone's list, Austin. I didn't start talking to you because of a bet that ended months before I ever apologized to you in that library. I started talking to you because I couldn't stop thinking about the way you looked, hanging off that railing with eggs all over the floor, refusing to give me the satisfaction of watching you cry. I started talking to you because some broken, cowardly part of me had been noticing you all semester and didn't know how to do it without also hurting you." "That doesn't fix it," I said. The old fear still loud in my chest, demanding to be heard, demanding I protect myself the way I always had before he came along and made me forget how. "I know it doesn't fix it," he said. "I'm not asking you to just believe me because I want you to. Ask anyone who actually knew about that bet. Ask Derek, even. He hated me for backing out of it the way I did, said I'd ruined the whole point by actually catching feelings instead of just collecting a win. I never collected anything from you, Austin, because somewhere in the middle of trying to, I stopped being the person who could. I did ask Derek, eventually, though it cost me more pride than I wanted to spend asking him anything. And what he told me grudgingly in the awkward, half-apologetic way of someone admitting he'd been wrong about a person confirmed every word Jason had said, that the bet had ended in disgrace months before, with Jason walking away from the friend group that had built it, that his sudden interest in me afterward had baffled and frustrated the very people who might otherwise have used it against him, because it had never once looked like strategy. It had looked, Derek admitted, like the real thing. However unwelcome that observation had been to a group of guys who preferred their cruelty uncomplicated by sincerity. It took me another week before I let Jason back in, fully a week of careful distance that hurt both of us, a week where he kept showing up anyway, outside lecture halls at the reference desk, in messages that asked nothing of me except permission to keep trying. I needed that week. I needed to feel the choice in it, to know that coming back to him wasn't simply relief at the absence of pain, but a decision made with clear eyes, built on evidence instead of just longing. When I finally told him I believed him, really believed him, we were standing in almost the same spot as the rain confession. Though the sky that day was clear and unhelpfully ordinary, no dramatic weather to mark the moment. I needed to know you'd stay even when I made it hard, I told him. Not because I wanted to test you. Because I needed to know, for my own sake, that this wasn't just about how easy I was to love when everything was simple. I would have stood outside your door every night for the rest of the year if that's what it took, he said. I'm not going anywhere, Austin. Not because of a bet, not because of an apology I owe you, but because I have spent every day since that library trying to become someone worth the trouble of forgiving, and I'm not finished yet. I don't think I ever will be. I think loving you is going to be the project of the rest of my life, and I would like to start now, if you'll let me. I let him. I won't pretend the rest of the semester unfolded without complications, because love stories that pretend complications don't exist are lying to you, and I promised myself, telling this story, that I would not lie. There were people who didn't believe the change in him was real. Derek, for one, who cornered me outside the dining hall not long after the rain, his voice low and not entirely unkind, in the way that concern and cruelty sometimes wear the same clothes. You know he's going to go back to who he was, right? He said. Guys like Branch don't actually change, they just find a new way to perform whatever's convenient. I thought about that for longer than Derek probably expected me to, because it was a fair question, one I had asked myself in the dark more nights than I wanted to admit. Maybe, I said finally. Or maybe people get to change, and the people around them get to decide, every day, whether they're willing to witness it instead of just waiting for it to fail. Derek didn't have an answer for that, and he didn't bring it up again, though I caught him watching the two of us sometimes with an expression that had softened slowly. The way suspicion does when it runs out of evidence to feed on. There was also Jason's brother, the golden one, who came to visit campus one weekend and looked at me across a dinner table with an assessing kind of attention that made it very clear where some of Jason's old performance of confidence had been learned. So you're the one who finally got my brother to stop being insufferable, he said, in a tone I couldn't immediately place as mockery or genuine curiosity. I think he did that himself, I said. I just happened to be standing nearby when he decided to. Jason, beside me, reached under the table and found my hand, and held it the way you hold something you've decided you're done being careless with. He's right, Jason said to his brother, his voice steady in a way that hadn't existed in him months ago, back when steadiness was a costume instead of a fact. I did it for myself. He just gave me a reason to want to. His brother studied us both for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the easy, golden smile I'd half expected from someone who'd apparently spent a lifetime setting an impossible bar, but something smaller and more honest. Good, he said simply. It's about time someone made you nervous in a way that wasn't about disappointing Dad. The lecture hall, by the end of the semester, had become a different kind of stage entirely. Where it had once been the site of my smallest humiliations, performed for an audience that laughed because Jason told them to, it became, slowly and without either of us planning it, the site of something gentler. He started sitting beside me instead of near me, not performing the change for anyone watching. By then, almost nobody bothered to watch anymore, the novelty of our story having faded into something closer to background fact, the way all news eventually does, but simply because it was where he wanted to be. On the last day of lectures, the professor dismissed us early the way professors do when the semester has worn down everyone's patience equally, and the room dissolved into the particular chaos of 200 people packing bags and comparing notes on exams. none of us felt ready for. Jason caught my hand before I could disappear into the crowd, the way he always did now, an instinct instead of a question. "Walk with me?" he asked. "You say that like I'd ever say no." "You said no plenty at the start," he reminded me, and there was no bitterness in it, just a kind of gratitude for how far we'd come from those early nights at the reference desk, when no had been the only word I trusted myself to say. "That was before I knew you were capable of this," I said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us, at the months that had passed, at the strange architecture of forgiveness we'd built one small kindness at a time. We walked out of that lecture hall together into a campus gone soft and gold with the early edges of evening and somewhere behind us. In a building that had once held the worst of what either of us had been, the room emptied out the way it always did, indifferent now to the story it had hosted, already preparing itself for whatever the next semester's dramas would be. But for the two of us, walking out into that light hand in hand in front of anyone who cared to look, the story wasn't ending. It was only just beginning to be told the way it deserved, not as a tale of cruelty that happened to be followed by kindness, but as proof that the people who hurt us are not always beyond the reach of becoming someone better, and that sometimes, against every instinct that tells you to protect yourself by staying closed, it is worth letting them try. People ask me sometimes, now that enough time has passed, that the story has become something we can tell at parties instead of something either of us flinches from, whether I regret giving him the chance. Whether the months of pain were worth whatever came after. I never have a clean answer for that, because grief and love are not opposites, and I have learned to hold both without needing one to cancel out the other. What I tell them instead is this. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in a lecture hall full of people, and for one semester, I lived inside the version of that silence built from humiliation, the kind where every eye turned toward you only to watch you suffer. And then slowly, without any music swelling to announce it, that same silence became something else entirely, the kind that exists when two people who have hurt each other and healed each other in equal measure walk out of a room together, and the only thing left to say has already been said quietly in the space between two hands that finally, after everything, decided to hold on. Jason Branch was the worst thing that happened to me in that building for a while, and then, against every reasonable expectation I had for my own life, he became the best. Not because he erased what he'd done, but because he never once asked me to pretend it hadn't happened. He simply kept showing up every day, choosing to be someone worth forgiving, until one day I realized I already had. That, in the end, is the whole story. Not a boy who bullied me and was magically redeemed by love, but a boy who hurt me and then did the much harder, much slower work of becoming someone capable of being loved back, and a boy who let him, not because he deserved it without question, but because watching someone change, really change, in front of an audience that once only knew how to watch him be cruel, turned out to be the bravest thing either of us ever witnessed. The whole class watched him bully me. Now the whole class watches him chase me, across quads into rainstorms through every doubt I ever threw at him, and I have stopped being ashamed of being seen like this, loved finally, by someone who spent a long time learning how. I think about that lecture hall sometimes, even now, years removed from it, the way you think about a house you grew up in long after you've moved away, with a complicated tenderness, equal parts wound and home. We graduated 2 years after the egg incident in a ceremony full of caps thrown into a sky so blue it looked unreal, and Jason found me in the crowd afterward, the way he always found me. Cutting through a sea of relatives and classmates like my presence in a room was a fact he simply couldn't ignore. Gravity instead of choice. "Do you remember," he asked, slipping his hand into mine, the way it had become so natural to do that neither of us noticed it happening anymore, "the first thing I ever said to you that wasn't an insult?" "You mean other than the eggs," I said. "I mean the library. I told you I needed a book." "You were lying," I said. "You didn't need a book, you needed an excuse." "I needed you," he corrected, and I didn't know yet how to ask for that without dressing it up as something smaller. We have had since then an ordinary life in the best possible sense of that word, an apartment with too many books and not enough shelf space, an argument every few months about whose turn it is to do the dishes, a habit of leaving each other small notes that say nothing dramatic and mean everything anyway. Derek, of all people, became something like a friend over time. The kind of friendship built on having witnessed the worst of someone and stayed around long enough to see the best of them too. Priya. The girl who told me about the bet sent an apology 2 years later, awkward and a little defensive, which I accepted the way you accept any apology that arrives honestly. Even if late, not because it undid anything, but because holding on to every old grudge would have left no room in me for anything new. Jason's brother came to the wedding eventually years after that dinner table assessment and gave a toast that surprised everyone by being neither golden nor performed, just an honest, halting admission that he had spent years assuming his brother's softness was a weakness their father had successfully beaten out of him, and that watching Jason learn to be gentle again, deliberately, painfully, on purpose, had taught him more about courage than anything he'd ever achieved on a field or in a classroom. As for me, I think about the boy who used to sit 3 rows from the back by the window, calculating the safest path through a building that had become a minefield. And I feel for him the particular tenderness you feel for anyone who survived something you wish they hadn't had to survive at all. I wish I could go back and tell him that the boy calling his name like an insult would, one day, learn to say it like a vow instead. I wish I could tell him that the silence he dreaded, the kind that turns 200 faces toward your worst moment, would eventually become a different silence entirely, the kind that falls over a room when 2 people who have hurt each other and chosen each other anyway simply hold hands and let the world watch, because they have nothing left to hide. I can't go back and tell him that. But I can tell you, whoever you are, wherever you are in your own version of that lecture hall, sitting by your own window, calculating your own safest path. Sometimes the person who hurt you stays exactly who they were, and you are right to protect yourself from them for as long as it takes. But sometimes, against every reasonable expectation, they don't stay who they were. Sometimes they do the long, unglamorous work of becoming someone else entirely, one small kindness at a time, one apology that isn't quite enough followed by another and another until the math, against all odds, finally starts to balance. I don't know which kind of person you're dealing with. I only know which kind Jason Branch turned out to be, and I know that I would not trade a single rainy night, a single midnight phone call, a single hard week of necessary distance, for a version of this story where I never gave him the chance to prove it. The whole class watched him bully me. Now the whole class watches him chase me, and somewhere in the space between those 2 sentences, both of us became people we are, on the whole, very proud to be. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even 1 member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.